The Russian art of war. Very often we look at Russia and we try to mirror image and we think, all right, the way our military would fight, the way we conduct war is the way Russia conducts war. So if they don't do things the way we do, or if we don't see the outcome that we think we would get, then we calculate Russia must be bad. Russia must be evil. They must be incapable. And very oftentimes things are not exactly what they appear, especially people have different mindsets. We're going to unpack some of that today. And we are absolutely delighted to have live from Brussels, Colonel Jacques Baud, who is a retired colonel and a former member of the Swiss Intel Services, joining us from Europe. And Colonel, you know, you've written so many books on that. This is one of the recent ones we're going to talk about specifically today, the Russian art of war, how the West led Ukraine to defeat, which is a pretty shocking title for a lot of people. But given the current realities on the ground, and if anybody's been watching our channel very long, we are echoing that exact same outcome. It's almost like a dead man walking that we haven't acknowledged it. We're going to get into that in a minute. But first of all, I just want to welcome you to the show and ask you a little bit about, you know, kind of what your path has been. What have you done that helped you write these books?
Yeah, thank you very much for having me in your show that I have seen a couple of times, and very delighted to be with you today. Now, as you said, my background is strategic intelligence. I have studied econometrics, to be more precise, at the University of Geneva, and did my time in the military, the Swiss military. I'm colonel. I ended with the colonel of general staff, which is a title which is slightly above colonel in the Swiss Army. And I have spent most of my time in strategic intelligence during the Cold War. Then I have served in the UN on many capacities. My first assignment for the UN was during the Rwanda War in the mid 90s. Then I started to work because of my experience, because as I was in the strategic intelligence, I was in charge of the whole Warsaw Pact, and that included all the communist countries, so to say, including the forces which were abroad, including Afghanistan. I was in touch with the Afghan resistance. I wrote a book on demining for Ahmed Shah Massoud at the time. And based on that experience, after my time in the intelligence, I started to work for humanitarian demining in the UN, created the Geneva Center for Humanitarian Demining, and an information system as for mine action, which is currently active in about 70 countries. And
now, you also said that you were in NATO for 5 years. Is that correct?
And then my last assignment was in NATO, which is quite strange for a Swiss. Switzerland is neutral, but Switzerland is part of the Partnership for Peace. And in that context, Switzerland negotiated a position within NATO. And I spent 5 years heading a small unit dedicated to the struggle against, dedicated to counter-proliferation of small arms, especially in the North African region and the Middle East.
So, and what years was that when you were in NATO?
Say again? I was based. Sorry, I interrupted you, and so I didn't answer your question. Sorry.
Oh, I'm sorry. Well, what years were you in NATO? What 5 years? When?
That was between 2012 and 2017. About. So that means
is that when you retired?
Yeah, exactly. And that's why when the Maidan and the Ukrainian revolution happened exactly during my time in NATO. And since there were some concerns in the NATO that the rebels in Ukraine, the Donbass rebels, could get weapons from Russia, that was one of my area of interest, if you want. So I received a lot of information about what happens in this region, and I followed this region closely. In addition to that, I am one of the UN experts on the reform of security institutions, and in that capacity, NATO also engaged me in the reform of the Ukrainian army because NATO was sponsoring a couple of projects funded by some countries, notably UK, to reform the Ukrainian military in the late 2014 and 2015. And I was involved in that project too. So that means that I had a pretty good contact with the situation in Ukraine
Got it.
and the
Got it.
situation there.
So let me ask you. Let's kind of take a little detour down there, a little bit different than what I had planned here, but that's a fascinating possibility here. One of the things I have always wanted to know from a non-propaganda position, because it's hard to decipher truth from not in things that are publicly announced. But in that Maidan period, especially from the time of February of 2014 up until things really blew up in the east there in the Donbass area, lots of conflicting information. One says that the Ukrainian side and the military tried to put down the unrest against the people with significant violence, and only then did Russia bring troops in or equipment, the little green men, so-called. And another version says, no, everything was relatively fine, but then Russia brought all these people in, and that prompted Kiev to send troops out there. How did that actually take place?
No, well, there are two different things here. First of all, there's the situation in Crimea, which is special because in Crimea, you had already Russian troops. According to the so far, the status of force agreement between Ukraine and Russia, Russia had about 20,000 troops stationed in the Crimea. And basically, these guys were allowed to go out of their garrison in case of troubles to ensure the security of the line of the strategic logistical lines. That mean, for instance, the airport of Sebastopol, and they were also allowed to go out of their garrison to make sure that there were no let's say a law enforcement issue against the installations there. So what happened there is that the key issue of the whole conflict was the decision of the new government on 23rd of February 2014, when they decided to make the Russian language not an official language. And that triggered trouble and demonstration in the whole south of Ukraine. And when these troubles appeared in Crimea, because the population is mainly Russian, then the Russian troops were allowed to go out of the garrison to protect their installations, and they because there were so confrontation between the demonstrators and the militias of the Ukrainian government, Putin agreed to have the troops deployed there as part of the law enforcement to separate the two.
Okay.
And what happened there is that the Ukrainian army was built around a territorial structure, meaning that most of there were at that time 22,000 Ukrainian troops deployed in Crimea, Ukrainians. And these guys were mostly Russian speaking, meaning that when the clashes started between Russian speaking and Ukrainian speaking, those troops changed side. They literally removed their insignia,
Really?
and
Dad
they
not heard
changed
that.
side. Exactly. And that's where we were talking about those little green men, because they had no insignia anymore. That's the origin of the
No
little green
kidding.
men. And I mentioned in my books, because that was documented. I mean, that was confirmed by Ukrainian parliamentarian. About out of the 22 Russian soldiers deployed in Crimea, 20,000 changed side. So 90% of the troops changed side in favor of the Russian speaking, and then they
So
became
then
those
truly it
troops.
was a civil war.
It was absolutely. It was a civil war situation. It was not civil war full scale because they
Yeah.
didn't really shoot, but it was an extremely tense situation. And I remember when I was NATO, we received those information, but nobody wanted to believe that because, of course, it didn't confirm the narrative that Russia was invading a Crimea and things
Right.
like that. I think at a certain point, the NATO leadership decided that to prohibited to use the word invasion because it was not an invasion factually, it was an intervention by Russian troops in Crimea. In the Donbass, there a completely different story because there were
Mm.
absolutely no troops there. And despite all the efforts deployed by the Western, the NATO and others to find if there were troops in the Donbass, we didn't find any indication that there were Russian troops in the Donbass. And even the Ukrainian general staff and even the Ukrainian security service, the SBU at that time, confirmed that there were no Russian troops in Donbass. What happened is that you had a few Russian soldiers or Russians, individuals who went to help and assist the Donbass rebels, and they just got a Kalashnikov and went there. There's the same thing that we had in Switzerland during the Balkan War,
Mm.
because you say that you know that in Switzerland, every soldier had the weapon at home, so we
Yeah.
have all the whole military gear at home. And during the Balkan War, you had Swiss soldiers. They went on
Mm.
the Friday evening with their cars and the assault rifle in the back of the car. They went to Bosnia. They had a nice weekend shooting around, and then they came back on Monday morning. So that's exactly the same thing that happened in the Donbass region. Exactly the same
So,
thing.
so if you could say who actually started the large scale offensive operations in 2014, was it the Kiev side or was it the rebel side?
No, that was the it's an interaction because what happened in the Donbass, exactly the same thing has happened in Crimea, in the sense that the Russian speaking soldiers defected to the rebels. And so
Yeah.
you had complete regiments, including
Wow.
artillery pieces and ammunition and all that.
Fascinating.
The famous artillery, it started as a company, the Kalmius, that was an artillery company, but just a few pieces, and within weeks it became a brigade because the Ukrainian soldiers defected with all the weapons, artillery pieces, ammunition, and all the
Wow.
gear. So that's how the rebels got their weapons, and that's a thing that we noticed at that time with the information that was available to NATO at that point. So we
Wow,
knew
that is
that.
absolutely fascinating. Well, I could spend the whole hour talking about that, but we may want to come back to that. But let's get into the situation that we have right now, because I'm going to play a couple of comments from some of our senior leaders right now, the things that have been said in just the last few days, and then I'm going to touch on something that you said in a previous interview not long ago, and I'm going to kind of get you to expand on that. First of all, let's start off with Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin, when he basically says the U.S. cannot let Ukraine fail.
Ukraine won't back down, and neither will the United States. The United States will not let Ukraine fail. Just last week, the United States announced additional security assistance for Ukraine valued at $300 million. This is an extraordinary measure to support Ukraine's most pressing needs for air defense, artillery, and anti-tank capabilities. We were only able to support this much needed package by identifying some unanticipated contract savings.
Now, he went on to say a little bit further from there the reason why it was so important for us to give them those weapons, because if we don't, Putin's coming for us.
The Czech Republic
Well, that's
recently
that's
procured
an
800,000
interesting
urgently
thing.
needed artillery shells. Germany, France, Denmark, and Sweden have each recently announced important new military aid packages. We will all be less secure if Putin gets his way, and we will all be less secure in a lawless, violent world where dictators can redraw borders by force, wipe countries off the map, and rebuild their old empires. So Ukraine's battle remains one of the great causes of our time. And the Ukrainian people do not have a day to waste, and neither do we.
So he says it's the great cause of our time. Putin will redraw the map of Europe. Basically, they're all coming for us if we don't stop him in Ukraine. What do you say to that? You're muted there.
Sorry, yeah, sorry. First of all, in the last 2 years, we spent our time to hear that Russia had no weapon anymore, that their tanks were not working, that their officers were incapable, that they had no ammunition, that everything was going wrong with the Russia. And today they are threatening the whole Europe. So I think there is a total nonsense here. That's the first. That's the first thing. And secondly, there's a second thing to note here, that 2 years ago, and in the last 2 years, let's say, the narrative was Russia cannot win, or the Ukraine will win. And today, the narrative is we cannot allow Russia to win. So that means that the whole thing, everything we have said so far, had absolutely no sense at all. We had the impression that we could reach Moscow, so to say, thanks to the sanctions. And in fact, there is an interesting thing that happened in 2019. Alexei Arestovich, who was one of the advisors, personal advisors to Zelensky, made an interview in 2019, in March 2019, saying that in order for Ukraine to be able to enter NATO, Russia should be defeated. And in order to defeat Russia, the idea is to have a war with Russia. And so with sanction, a combination of sanction and military action, Russia would be defeated, and that would then open the door for Ukraine to enter NATO. The problem was that because of Article 5, NATO cannot really accept a country which is already in a conflict situation. As a result, you needed to have a proper defeat of Russia in order to allow Ukraine to enter. And that's exactly the calculation. And in fact, where the thing is that Zelensky was probably lured into a conflict that he would think that would last just a couple of days, probably weeks, and that was it. And that explains why because there is also something we always tend to forget, is that on the 24th of March 2021, Zelensky published a decree to reconquer the Donbass and Crimea. And from that point on, the Ukrainian forces started to build up at the border of Donbass. That's the decree that's
wait. Hang on. So during a time in May, you said March of 2021, when there was still talk about let's implement the Minsk agreements that the four parties had signed, Russia, Germany, France, and Ukraine, he signed a decree that called for the military reacquisition of the Donbass and Crimea?
Exactly.
Did not know that either.
Yeah, it is published. I mean, you can see it. I mean, this is my books. I have written that in my books. It was in fact, the terminology is the reconquest of Crimea and the south of the country. And from that point, that's the point where you see the build up of the Ukrainian army in the Donbass. And that's also to reciprocate that, you had the build up of the Russian forces at the Ukrainian border. So the build up of the Russian forces in late March, early April 2021 had a reason. And this reason was this decree. You see? And, everything follows very logically if you take all the elements in the equation. The problem is that the narrative we have to explain the whole conflict uh, forgets a few items. As a result, we have the impression that the Russians started the whole thing, but in fact, it was a calculation. And if you read, I mentioned also that a couple of times, you had also in March, April 2019, you had a report from the Rand Corporation that you probably know, because it's a famous institution in the US. I mean, a think tank for the Pentagon, basically. And in that report, which is named, if I remember, it's Extending Russia and a very long time, but it starts with Extending Russia. The issue is how we can destabilize Russia and how we can weaken Russia. In that document, you have, and it's a 300 pages document, so it's not just a few pages. And if you read that document, you will see the whole scenario of what we have seen in the last 2 years, not only basically in Ukraine, but also like Finland and Sweden joining NATO, and the issue between Azerbaijan and Armenia. Everything is in that document. So
Wow.
everything.
No, I have not seen that one. I've seen some of them from Rand, but not that one. I will definitely do so
Well,
today,
you,
though.
you, you can download it, and you
Yeah.
will see the whole thing. That are very nice summaries, a summary of all the measures that contain this document. And you will see there are about 5 or 6 measures, I don't remember, but all these 5 or 6 measures comprise everything you have seen in the last 2 years, not only in Ukraine but also Armenia and all that. And
Now
and
let me ask you this. Let me shift. Well, actually, not shift gears. Let me just continue on, because in your book, I think the subtitle is "How the West Led Ukraine to Defeat." Now, I think maybe that might be some of the things here, but I want to play you a clip from Lindsey Graham. I think it was just yesterday or day before, which, in light of now more than 2 years of war, in light of the failed 2023 offensive, in light of the fact that they still haven't gotten enough money here, and that Russia now is ramping up all their military industrial capacity and their manpower, he says this.
70% of Republicans in the Senate understand the need to help Ukraine, that if you don't stop Putin now, it goes further, that there'll be a war between NATO and Russia. If you don't stop him here, no Americans are dying. I think a majority of Republicans in the House feel the same way.
But in a recent interview, you actually took issue with that premise that Putin is coming after us when you said this.
He made very clear in his address to the Russians on the 24th of February 2022, he said, "We will demilitarize and denazify the threat to the population of the Donbass." So it was not about demilitarizing the whole NATO or whatever. That was focused on the protection of the population of Donbass.
So you say that this was never been about conquering all of Ukraine, going into the Baltics, going into Poland, etc. What makes you so confident of that?
Well, because first of all, there are two different indications of that. First of all, it's what Putin himself said. I mean, when he started the operation, he stated the objectives of that operation, and the objectives were clearly what I just said: demilitarization, denazification of the threat against the population of Donbass. Then, when we see the forces that were committed to that operation, we see that these forces were not structured, organized, and had not also the size to take over and occupy Ukraine as a whole. And we have also to remember that the western part of Ukraine, even during the Cold War, that was one of the area of Ukraine that has been extremely nationalistic. And in the late 40s up to the early 60s, the Western powers, namely the US and UK and France, namely the secret clandestine services, supported insurrection in that area. And that was the same in Lithuania, for instance, and Estonia, you had very strong rebellion or guerrilla movements supported by the West during the early stages of the Cold War. And the Russians know that perfectly. They know that these regions would be extremely difficult to occupy because of the extreme nationalistic sentiments that you have in those regions. And I think that was never the objective of the Russians. But we have to be careful, because what I explain also in my book is that the way of thinking of the Russians, and that's why it's important to understand the Russian art of war. They think according to the, let's say, the way Clausewitz thought war. That means that you reach an operational objective in order to reach other kind of objectives. So you try to reach a tactical objective to have an operational advantage, or you reach operational objectives in order to have a strategic advantage. That means that when you make war, you have always an objective ahead, in front of you. And that means that most probably, even if he didn't stated that, the idea of Putin when he attacked or he launched his offensive was that by gaining a success in the Donbass region, he could handle that, or he could negotiate that or trade that against a superior objective that could be, for instance, neutrality of Ukraine. And that, by the way, almost was succeeded, because when Zelensky offered to the Russians mid-March 2022, he offered a solution to the conflict. He made a proposal, and in that proposal was stated the withdrawal of all Russian troops from Ukraine, and in exchange of that, he would guarantee, he would state that Ukraine would remain neutral under the supervision of about 10 countries, I don't remember. But so, meaning that, first of all, we see from that proposal of Zelensky that was almost accepted by the Russians, by the way. Almost because of Boris Johnson and all that, Zelensky withdrew his proposal. But anyway, the Russians were ready to go into that proposal, meaning that they didn't want to have the whole of Ukraine. They wanted a solution for the Donbass and a solution for the neutrality of Ukraine. And Zelensky captured that in his proposal. So it's absolutely consistent. If we see the only thing which is totally inconsistent is the way the Western powers entered the conflict, or started to get involved in that conflict. They didn't understand anything.
Right. And of course, it went south from there. Then now Putin has hardened his position. He said, okay, forget about, we're not going to talk, because Zelensky said they weren't going to talk. And then we had that whole summer offensive in 2023, and things started, getting into a protracted long-term war. Well, then, as I said, the offensive completely failed. And then we started getting into 23, and then now into 2024. And the capacity for Ukraine to wage war, the capacity for the West to support war, is now dramatically fallen off in contrast to what it's doing in Russia, where it's on the increase now. So by every rational analysis and any calculation, it would be in the best interest of the West to cut the losses, to get this off the table, and to start moving on to something else, and say, all right, well, we gave it a try, it didn't work. Instead, we have the French president saying this.
On the other hand, they have not decided to send any troops at all. And they let you know as soon as you said that.
We can always come back to that, and I'm going to get to the bottom of it.
That's what the French are asking.
But they're absolutely right. But I say today, we've decided on this, and it's a change. We decided it in Paris. It's the start of a new awakening. Then, I tell you, we'll do what's necessary to achieve our goal.
So it's a new awakening. So the 2 years of war has that's in the past, but now we have a new awakening, and we are going to make sure that Russia loses. He said that several times during that interview. Does France and the West writ large have the capacity to make Russia lose?
No, certainly not. And for many reasons. First of all, we are in the kind of a so-called sunk cost fallacy. with the French and the Europeans at large, basically. Nota bene, the Americans in that context seem to be much more prudent than Emmanuel Macron. But in Europe, there is a sense that we cannot just stop there. I mean, Putin has to suffer a little bit more, and that's the whole thing. But now back to your question, the French forces are not equipped, are not, and basically this is not just the problem of France. In the last 30 years, the Western armies have been tailored for, I would almost say, colonial conflicts. I mean, conflicts in the Middle East with against very light equipped
Yes.
armies with no air force. And so that's why, for instance, we have very light capacities in terms of anti-aircraft defense, for instance, because during the last 30 years, we didn't need that. So we focused on light equipment, on large scale production of armored vehicles, very high vehicles that you use in counterinsurgency environment. And in my last book, I make comparison with those vehicles that we delivered to the or supplied to the Ukrainians. We gave very high vehicles which are very well suited in counterinsurgency environment, while the Russians have still BMP and BTR vehicles which are
Very
extremely low. Exactly.
Yeah.
Because they are tailored for the fight on these huge plains that you have in Ukraine and Russia, and they are much more difficult to as a target to acquire because they are very low on the ground. So we gave the wrong weapons because we don't have the right ones, because our armies, yes,
Designed for a different kind of war. Yeah.
yes, exactly. This is exactly the point. And today we see that even the Ukrainian soldiers said, because you had those Ukrainians trained in West Germany, I mean in Germany and in UK and so on, and they complained. They said, well, we are not trained for the right war. These guys are trainers, and they were talking about the UK, if I remember well, UK trainers, which are very good soldiers, by the way. I used to spend some times in the British Army during the Cold War. I mean, these are excellent soldiers. The problem is that they're not trained for this kind of war.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, 40 years ago, they were trained for war in Central Europe. Everybody was focused on that kind of warfare. I mean, intensive warfare with tank and you know, this combined warfare, combined arms warfare.
Yes.
But today, this was in the last 30 years, this type of combined armed warfare were not exactly used in the same way, and certainly not with the same instruments. Look at the problem of the M777 and the Caesar howitzer that the French delivered to Ukraine. I mean, these are designed for sniping artillery, so to say, for extremely precise, but they are not designed to fight an intense artillery war, as you can see in Ukraine. And as a result, we see that we have given very good equipment, but not designed for this type of war.
Not the right kind of equipment. So let me ask you, is that part of the subtitle of your book, How the West Led Ukraine to Defeat?
Exactly.
I assume that you are of the opinion that the war is already lost and it's basically a dead man walking. It's only a matter of how bad is it going to be and what's the final solution. But what is the general thrust behind your opinion that the West led Ukraine into defeat?
Well, there are two aspects of that. The first of all, as you just mentioned, I mean, as we just discussed, is a question of how adequate was the equipment we provided to Ukraine. That's one thing, and the training as well. The other thing is, and I think more importantly at strategic level, is that we tragically underestimated the capabilities of Russia. I mean, the whole strategy, and when we hear what Zelensky said at the beginning of the war, the idea was that Russia would be defeated at economic level through the sanctions, being isolated on the political stage, being isolated on economic stage as well. And basically, with all the sanctions, we expected the Russian economy to crush down, and that the problem is that then Russia would not be able to sustain the war effort in Ukraine. That was the idea, and then on the military side, you could defeat easily the Russian army. That was the calculation. The problem is that to go into that kind of thinking, we have to underestimate very significantly the Russian economy. And as we have seen,
Yeah.
the Russian economy is extremely resilient. Basically, the thing is that Russia has not only a oil station as it was said by McCain at that time. At the time, he used to say that Russia is just an oil station or something like that, a gas station. No, it's a little bit more than this. They have a very capable industry. They have extremely a lot of resources, both intellectually and in terms of let's say capabilities of intellectual capabilities and all that. And they were able to create, so to say, or to amplify their industrial production, both military and on the civilian side. And at the same time, by having all these resources, oil, gas, and all that, I mean, they will always have a client for that. And
Yeah.
if the Europeans don't want it, the China will get it. And that, in fact, we reinforced China, we reinforced the rest of the world, and we weakened Europe. And
So-
that, yes.
So let's talk about where this is given all that. And this has been an incredible show so far with a lot of information even I didn't know, and I consider myself very knowledgeable about some of these things here. But the question is now, if indeed Ukraine has at least strategically already lost, even if fighting's still going on in the battlefield and the tactical level, the question is, how does it end? And it seems to me it's one of two ways. Either one, that we're finally going to acknowledge reality and compel Ukraine to seek a negotiated settlement and support that in however we want to. That would be the wisest course of action and the least cost given the damage already done. But the second one seems to me that we can continue to ignore reality and push Putin into a place where something even worse could happen. Here's what he said just a few days ago.
I will tell you what we are saying on this matter and what we are conveying to the US leadership. If you really want to stop fighting, you need to stop supplying weapons. It will be over within a few weeks. That's it. And then we can agree on some terms. Before you...
How do you think the full-fledged conflict between Russia and NATO, is it possible? And how probable is it? Well, I think everything is possible in the modern world. And as I said before, and it is clear to everyone that this will be one step away from a full-fledged World War III.
So if the West makes good on like what Macron said or what some of these others say, we just keep pushing the line and put longer range missiles and cross Putin's red lines, which he said the other day, you don't have red lines, then neither will I. So it seems we're pushing into more and more risky territory where he could escalate up. You know Putin very well. I know you've written some books specifically on him. When you hear him say stuff like that and you see the whole layout of all the things we've talked about, how far will he go? And is there an off-ramp that doesn't lead to escalation?
Well, I would phrase your question differently. I would say, where does the West, how far wants the West go? Because the problem seems to me that Putin is extremely rational in the decision. I mean, everything we have seen from the Russian general staff and the political leadership in Russia is extremely rational. And we see that they advance in a very measured way in some way. The problem is that we have seen, especially in the last couple of weeks, in the West, and particularly in the Baltic states, and Poland and France, kind of an exaggeration in the way they want this conflict to continue, and with a sense that these guys are totally disconnected from any reality, and that's very much the case with Emmanuel
And
Macron.
very much a danger.
Exactly, and that's a danger, in fact, because I have the feeling that those guys are being caught into a narrative, and they are so arrogant and self-conscious that they will be very hardly go back from that narrative. While on the Russian side, and it's always a response. It's very interesting. Even when, for instance, Vladimir Putin talked about nuclear weapons, for instance, it was always as a response from a provocation made in the West. You remember what Liz Truss, at that time she was a candidate as a prime minister for UK, and she said in a TV interview that she was ready to go into global nuclear war. I mean, that's just incredible for someone who seek to be prime minister of a large European country. She was ready to press the button for a global war. So, in that respect, Vladimir Putin never said so, but he said, if you want to go nuclear, we have the way to respond. And that's always the way the Russians have responded. So the West seemed to be taken into almost prisoner of their own narrative, and
Yeah.
they are difficult. I mean, they have difficulties to go back from that narrative, to think a little bit and to think about the solution, because the problem that Ukraine faces, if we continue that way, and we see that it's already a problem at a human resources level, because now they don't have combatant anymore, so they have to recruit people, and you have to remember that all the people that you send to the front line are people you're taken from the economy. That means that you weaken your economy to fight a combat that is almost already lost. So you will lose this capacity, and the reconstruction afterwards will be extremely difficult. So I have very hard time to understand how the Western leaders think, basically. My feeling, coming from my intelligence and strategic intelligence background, I don't understand how the connection between their own intelligence
Right.
services and the decision making. I mean, there must be something broken in that line, because the decisions are totally irrational, and that's from the very beginning. I mean, you mentioned at the very beginning of our talk that there was this issue of the Minsk agreement and all that. I mean, everybody could see that. I mean, all the documents I've mentioned and all that, that's public. I mean, there's
Yeah.
nothing mysterious or secret about this. So any serious intelligence service could have identified those issues. By the way, the Rand Corporation report that I mentioned before explained in plain word that if the US would apply the suggested strategy, it would lead to significant territorial losses from Ukraine, significant human losses for Ukraine, and they would be pushed into a disadvantageous peace talks with Russia. So we knew perfectly the risks of that strategy. And that's in plain
That's
words in the report. So the Rand
that's
Corporation,
unbelievable.
that is
You know, and,
unbelievable.
and I hear a lot of frustration in your voice, which mirrors mine. We had Ambassador Chaz Freeman on, who was talking about the issue about the kind of the disconnect between rational thinking and what we're doing, and how it tailed out of the Cold War, and where it may go from here. I'm going to get your comments on the backside of this.
The Cold War began with a diplomatic strategy called containment. By the end of the Cold War, that had become a military strategy. The Cold War left us with 700, 800 bases all over the world, and with defense commitments to protect virtually everybody. And it was followed by a moment of triumphalism in which we advanced our sphere of influence in Europe steadily to the borders of Russia, which alarmed Russia, which warned us consistently as we did that it would be forced to react, and which has reacted. So I think in many ways we live in a world that the Cold War is shaped. There's no reason to believe that if this war in Ukraine spreads, or if we get into a war with China, that it's going to be a Cold War.
Yeah, the fear is not a new Cold War, but an actual new hot war. And I'm sorry, I want to show you one more thing, because this kind of talks to what you said a second ago about how the disconnect between reality. This is what's passing for diplomacy right now in the United States by our president, who publishes something close to a commercial to try and push forward an agenda. Check this out.
We have to stand up to Putin and pass the national bipartisan bill, the National Security Bill, supporting Ukraine as they defend themselves against Putin's vicious onslaught, and prove to the world once more America can be relied on. We stand strong with our allies. We have to remember who we are. We're the United States of America. We keep our commitments. We never walk away from our friends. And we sure as hell don't bow down to Vladimir Putin.
So you see on there, basically, he has tied the United States to an outcome on the ground in Ukraine, which cannot be met. So then that gets back to my original question here. What is the end game here? What is the off ramp? If we're saying this and Putin's not going to back down, where does this go?
Well, that's a real question. I agree with you. And the problem is that we tend, probably because of our military background, we tend to think rationally, because a real military work with the reality on the ground. We are not thinking in fantasies. We work with the reality on the ground. Now, the problem is that if we think rationally, we think that the solution can only be in diplomacy somehow. The problem is that apparently our leaders, both in Europe and the US, discard this option and want to continue in a kind of a war that has no end and no objective. Because what does it mean? I mean, the word victory or defeat or all that needs to be defined. And in fact, we don't even know where we want Ukraine, because we know that the capabilities and the capacities we can provide to Ukraine cannot help Ukraine to regain the territory it lost. So, meaning that, how do we define success? How do we define the objective that we want Ukraine to achieve? And I think even Ukraine doesn't know what it can achieve and if it can achieve. So we are in a total void. And that's what strikes me in the whole thing. We have nothing concrete to think about. I mean, if you have a concrete objective, like taking over that city or something like that, then you have something concrete, which is sizable, that you can grasp, you can mobilize your force, you can build up, exactly, and you can do it. But here, nobody knows exactly. Everybody understands that pushing the Russian back would be impossible. I mean, they tried last year with this counteroffensive that failed miserably. And now we know that the West is not able to provide enough equipment. We have to, again, the objective of Putin that it stated in February 2022 was to demilitarize Ukraine. In fact, he achieved this objective 3 times. Once in May, June 2022, as the Ukrainians themselves, I mean, Zelensky himself said, from now on, we are depending on the West, because the Ukrainian army potential was destroyed. And from that point, you had the Eastern European countries providing old storage equipment, I mean, old stock equipment, old T-72s and things like this to Ukraine to reconstitute their potential. And this potential was destroyed by the end of 2022. And from that point, the West started to consider to provide tanks like Leopard 2 and Abrams and all that. That's the third army. And this third army, the third Ukrainian army, the current Ukrainian army, is almost exclusively made with Western equipment. And this third army was almost totally destroyed since the summer 2023. And now we have this third Ukrainian army with equipment that you cannot even, I mean, you are military, you know that if you want to integrate, I mean, the whole issue in combined warfare is the integration of your forces. You need to have compatible equipment, you need
Right.
to have equipment that have matching capabilities. And now what you have in your economy is a patchwork of equipment dating back from the 70s, even 60s, and probably the 80s, with modern equipment. These cannot be, these were conceived, the concept of those weapons were different. They were conceived for different type of weapons, for different type of conflicts. And now the Ukrainians tried to combine all this into a coherent operational approach, and we see that it's not possible. That's the reason why, for instance, you see those M1 Abrams used in the area of Avdiivka by the Ukraine as individual tanks, because they use their tanks as pillow box, basically, which is
Right.
not the way those tanks were designed for. I mean, they were designed for combined mobile warfare in interaction with close air support and all these kind of things. Now they are used, these weapons, independently, totally disconnected from an operational concept. As a result, we can hardly think about a victory with this. This is totally disconnected equipment and all that. So how do we envisage a success in that context? I mean, that's any
Jacques, I want to say, before I let you go, I want to, because this is so perfectly tied in here. We have a clip from Putin when he was talking to Tucker Carlson a month or so ago, where he was touching on the issue of, first of all, he was asked, would you talk to President Biden? And in his answer, he addresses what you just said there about recognizing that we're just giving him a patchwork of stuff that's not connected. And he's saying he's not really worried about the kind of equipment we give. Check this out.
I will tell you what we are saying on this matter and what we are conveying to the US leadership. If you really want to stop fighting, you need to stop supplying weapons. It will be over within a few weeks. That's it. And then we can agree on some terms. Before you do that, stop. What's easier? Why would I call him? What should I talk to him about? Or beg him for what?
And what messages do you get back?
You're going to deliver such and such weapons to Ukraine? Oh, I'm afraid, please don't. What is there to talk about?
So he seems to be saying this, recognizing the same thing you just said, that he recognizes it's just a patchwork of just stuff just kind of thrown in and hoping something works.
You know, you know as well as me that the success in operational warfare is the ability to integrate your forces. I mean, the tanks with artillery, with air, close air support, air force, and all that should be integrated into a system. And that includes also electronic warfare. It includes, I mean, all this aspect must be integrated in a coherent force. Now, if you have equipment that is not compatible with each other, that don't have the same capabilities and all that, you're not able to do that. So the idea that Ukraine can achieve an operational success with the kind of weapons that they have is just an illusion. I mean,
so let me ask you specifically on that, because that one I played by both, it's Lloyd Austin earlier and Lindsey Graham, were both saying we need to give this $60 billion again. We need to get it broke out of the Congress so that they can stop winning. We actually had Kirby, and I won't play that one at the moment, where he was saying it's desperate needed because that's the only thing holding them back. What do you say when you hear people say things like that? Will this $60 billion make a difference on the battlefield or not?
No. First of all, because those $60 billion, as you know, only a part of that will reach Ukraine, in fact, because most of that will be used to fund the provision of new weapons and pay people and all that. So only a fraction of that will reach Ukraine. That's the first point. The second point is that what we do is in fact just putting patches on a system which is dysfunctional because it was not
Well said.
designed that way. You know, an
Great point.
army must be designed as a system, and that's the basic. If you want, and that works for anything. That works for a guerrilla war, for instance. A guerrilla system must be designed as a system. If it's designed as a system, chances are good that it will work, regardless of the type of weapons. So the type of weapons basically is relevant as long as it is integrated into an operational concept.
Right.
Basically, that's
Well
why.
said.
To some extent, you could see that the Mujahideen were effective against the Russians, and the same with Viet Cong in Vietnam and things like that. The key of warfare is how you integrate your systems into one big large system that
And
is
so
consistent.
right now, it doesn't appear that we are aware of that at the higher levels, and certainly that we're going to do it. So your last word here, where does this go next? What can we expect to see in the coming months?
I think we are going towards additional successes from Russia because we don't want to stop. So that gives the Russians no choice. They said in October 2022 that their aim now, I mean from October onwards, was to grind down the Ukrainian army. And that's what they have done since October 2022. That means they don't want to reach big advances and big arrows on the map. This is not the idea. The idea is to destroy the Ukrainian potential. And that's what they are doing. They are doing that very consistently and they systematically. They don't want to make very risky operations where they can lose people. In fact, if you see the figures estimated by this website, which is called Media Zona, which is an opposition site that counts or estimates the Russian losses. And we can see that since last year, you have a decreasing trend of Russian losses. Why? Because they don't go into risky operation. They just wait for the Ukrainian to counterattack and they destroy them. And that goes systematically that way. And as a result, Ukrainians are lacking personnel, they're lacking equipment, and the West is not able to provide that. And that's the reason why you have people like Macron, which feel obliged to come to provide troops, because what is missing in Ukraine are troops. And so, yeah, and the result is that if we don't stop this thing and we continue to provide weapons to Ukraine, the Russians will systematically destroy the Ukrainian potential, and we will have finally a country which is made up just by women. And even now, in some villages, there were some reports provided by some journalists. Exactly, that in some villages you have only women, and we are going into that direction, meaning that the country will be severely depleted in terms of human resources and even the reconstruction. And by the way, European Union committed for the reconstruction. I mean, good luck, because this is going to be extremely expensive.
Another big concerns. Well, listen, Colonel, we are so grateful you come on. This has been a spectacular show today. One of the best I think that we've done, the most illuminating for our audience. Very grateful that. Definitely want to have you back to talk some of these other issues in some more depth. In some of your other books, when you're talking about the Middle East, we definitely want to get you on that too. Thank you so much for coming on today.
That's my pleasure. Thank you very much for inviting me. Thank you.
And we thank you guys for watching too. We're always very grateful for our audience here because we remain unintimidated and uncompromised in bringing you the truth, no matter what it is, because you deserve to know what's really going on. Be sure to like this video and subscribe and share it to your friends, because they deserve to know what's going on as well. And we will see you on the next episode of the Daniel Davis Deep Dive.